Today we're going to talk a little bit about this stuff. How the heck do you pronounce it? Why do we use it? What the heck is it? When do we need to use it? What kind do I buy? It's pronounced gesso. We use gesso when we are priming a surface for painting. Gesso can be applied to any number of surfaces, such as canvas or linen, plastics such as vinyl, wood, glass, and many more things. You can also use gesso if you have a tear in your canvas to repair the canvas. That's something that I will show you in another video. Now, what gesso does is it primes a surface so our canvas is ready to accept paint. It gives the surface a tooth and something for the paint to adhere to. Without gessoing our linen canvases, our paint would just soak right in and look kind of splotchy. It also protects the linen under the canvas. Up until recently, artists have predominantly used oil paint, and a lot of the pigments and oils are corrosive in nature, so it protects the surface. Am I going to use a different kind of gesso for oil paint versus acrylic paint? While I can use this for oil and acrylics, gesso's meant for oil paintings typically used an animal fat as a binder, as opposed to chalk. Rabbit skin glue is something that was very popular in earlier gessos and that I still use for priming some of my oil paintings. We won't get into using this stuff because chances are you're probably not doing much oil painting yet, and this stuff can be pretty finicky to work with if you don't know how. So for now, if you're newer to painting, I would stick with using the all-purpose gesso. Gesso is made from a ratio of pigment and filler. There are different grades of gesso and there are different hardnesses of them. The consistency of gesso varies brand to brand. Some will be a little bit more liquidy, some will be more like a paste. Some of the thicker gessos can be applied with a palette knife to create interesting textures on your canvas. Now, the artist and student grade are going to differ in price and in quality. Artist grade stuff is going to have more pigment than it does filler and be more opaque. I tend to recommend the Golden brand because they're pretty decent quality and you can buy a lot of different kinds of gesso. There are differences in opacity, hardness, color, etc. They do make a gesso spray, but unless you are experienced with using sprays, I recommend just getting the liquid version in a bottle or a jar or a tube when you're first starting. You can add pigment to your mixture of gesso to give it a little more color. Gesso does come in various colors such as black, white, etc. Normally you're going to buy your gesso in just plain white. We're going to focus on using gesso to prime a canvas. Now, most of the canvases that you buy are going to be pre-primed. It's not a bad idea to add a couple extra layers of primer to it. You always want to make sure anything you are painting, such as linen, is pre-stretched when you apply gesso because it can crack. But most of your canvases and linens and things are going to be pre-stretched for you. If your canvas is pre-primed, do you really need to gesso it? Well, no. I almost always gesso my canvases because it creates a smoother surface for me to work on, and I find that the quality and the vibrancy of the paint is really brought forward by having that base layer. Now, if you want a smooth surface, I recommend sanding in between layers with a 240 grit sandpaper or higher. What this does is it creates a very smooth, even surface, which is great for photorealistic paintings. If you're preparing a surface for painting that has not yet been primed, mix a little bit of water in with your gesso for your first layer. Having a clean cup with water handy is always recommended. Have a separate container handy to put your gesso in, especially if you are mixing it with water. You don't ever want to put a dirty brush or a brush with water back in your container of gesso. You want to keep that pure. Make sure to clean the overspill off from your rim, or it will harden and make your container difficult to open next time. When priming your surface, I recommend having a flat brush or a filbert. Those will spread the gesso out evenly on your canvas. I tend to like to use these brushes as opposed to these ones. Now typically, the bigger the surface you have, the bigger the brush you want to use. Like I said, I recommend using a flat brush or a filbert, something with a very small taper. Now that you have your gesso in a separate jar, I didn't mix any water in this one because this canvas has already been pre-primed, but not enough to my liking, so I'm going to make the surface a little bit more smooth. And we have our separate jar with gesso in it. We're not dipping any dirty brushes back into our container of gesso. If I'm doing a particularly large area, sometimes what I like to do is I like to lay the canvas flat and pour the gesso straight on the canvas. One thing I like to use is a flat window squeegee to spread it evenly on the canvas. I'm just going to show you the brush method for today because you're probably going to be working on smaller surfaces for now. And what you're going to do is you are going to start at one end and apply it with broad, even strokes. You can do the sides. I like to do the sides to make sure there's no buildup. Make sure that paint is a little bit uniform on the canvas. And at the edges, I always like to smooth the paint out before applying my next layered section. And I blend them into one another. That keeps you from getting any really bad bumps or lines on your canvas. So I always blend out that edge a little bit. And make sure that you don't go back over the same layer too many times. It starts to dry. What that does is it pulls some of the already dried gesso up off of the canvas and creates these ugly little bumps and chunks. So once that's down, you don't want to go back over it again. You want to just keep working until you get all the way down to the end. Make sure you don't blob it on too thick or it can make it hard to spread around. So work in many coats and in thin coats. Usually on an already primed canvas, I add at least 2 coats, but not always. It depends on what I'm doing. Zoom in a little bit more so you can see. Now see how I blended very lightly into that other layer and I kind of stopped where I started? You don't want to blend back too much. You want to keep moving down, but keep your surface nice and even. Once you're done, you want to smooth out any paint that may have, or any gesso that may have collected on the sides, so you don't get any little bumps. And when you're done, make sure to wash your brush thoroughly immediately, because gesso hardens and can ruin your brushes. Now when this layer is done drying, usually in 2 to 3 hours, sometimes I'll leave it to dry overnight if it's a larger surface, I will take a high grit sandpaper and I will just sand that down before applying my next layer of gesso. Sanding in between layers is very important, as well as cleaning it off properly in between layers. Tacky cheesecloth is really useful when cleaning these things off. I also like to use old pantyhose. You'd be surprised by how many uses I find for old pantyhose. Now I'm gonna let this dry overnight before I sand. Hopefully you found this crash course on gesso useful. If anybody has any further questions, you know how to find me, but now you know the gist of gesso.